Hi there, my name is Kate McGuigan. I'm a clinical nurse specialist in MS in Glasgow. So I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about an audit that I did as part of the MS Academy Intermodule project, looking at the use of telehealth within our MS service, titled Telehealth is for Life and Not Just the Pandemic. So the background to this is the MS team here in Greater Glasgow and Clyde provides care for a population of over 3,000 patients with MS across the west of Scotland. So historically, although Glasgow is there kind of in the blue, we also have patients from NHS Highland, Ayrshire and Lanarkshire as well. So our population is quite spread out. The team comprises 5 consultants, 5 nurses, 2 physios and an MS pharmacist as well. And each MS nurse runs 3 return clinics per week, as well as sharing 1 newly diagnosed clinic. And we also take a day triaging the advice line. So what was the problem? Well, COVID, as it did with many services, just fundamentally changed our standard practice. By sort of mid-March time, all of our clinics had transformed across to telephone or video appointments. We were fortunate enough not to need to redeploy any staff, so our service continued pretty much uninterrupted. But what we did notice was that calls to our MS advice line were far above any of our scheduled consultations. And we needed to identify what was happening there so we could support our patient group. So what I did was to look at a pragmatic kind of 2-part retrospective design, where I would look at peak stress periods on the service that kind of coincided with COVID waves. So you'll see from the graph there on the right, this is the data from the Scottish Government. You'll see that the cases are there in blue, admissions to wards in red, and then obviously deaths there in green. And I looked specifically at the peak points there. During the first wave, I also gave some consideration to the impact of COVID in the rest of the UK. So obviously our patient group was aware of COVID. And when I looked back at the numbers of calls, actually it was slightly higher in the first wave in Scotland as people were getting anxious about COVID. I also then looked at 2 mirrored periods in March and October of 2019 as well. But there was an immediate problem. And some of you will be familiar with the saying, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we found, that there is no central record of calls to the MS advice line at all. So obviously when patients are phoning in, we are documenting, we are generating letters, but they weren't being measured. So in retrospect, this was very difficult to identify. The only way in the end was to look at my own records, which, there were some limitations with in terms of completeness due to either service demand or leave. So all of the data that I have here really is probably an underestimate of what actually went on during the COVID pandemic. So I managed to identify 385 calls over the 5 ordered periods. So this is just calls that were taken by me or made by me to patients. It excludes any calls to GP practices, referrals, other services. And then what I did was first look at the frequency of calls throughout the COVID waves, and then try and estimate the demand for the MS service. And then I created a coding frame and looked at the content of each call and tried to analyze it in terms of COVID-19 and then other kind of key themes. So what we found, probably as we would expect, is that the numbers of calls to the service rose during COVID. The pre-COVID waves, probably this isn't complete data. I was new in post at the start of 2019, and my record keeping is probably not as robust as it is now. So those numbers probably were higher. So as you could probably imagine, things are looking fairly consistently high. But what I also did was to split up into calls that were driven by me and calls that were driven by the patients. And you can also see quite an increasing trend in my calls to patients throughout that period as well, which I found quite interesting, probably indicating some change in my own practice. What we then did is to look at a sampling frame of calls, which I did over a 2-week period, and look at the amount of time that these calls took. So obviously there's variation. Some calls took 5 minutes, other calls took 2 hours. But if we excluded these outliers and averaged it out, most calls are around about 25 minutes. So this is the time taken just on the phone. It doesn't include any actions, it doesn't include dictation or any letters that need to come as a part of that. So what you can see there is that actually the demand is really significantly high. So at its peak there during the first wave, 7.8 hours per week, just myself, is the equivalent of 2 additional clinics. And this is at the moment completely uncaptured within the service and therefore not resourced either. So far, probably so expected. But then when I broke it down to look at what it was we were talking about, something slightly different kind of happened. Obviously, in the first wave there, you can see that quite a large proportion of calls were about COVID. And when I mean COVID, what I mean is people calling about COVID risk, self-isolation, shielding, work, anything that was sort of related to or adjacent to COVID. Throughout the rest of the parts of the wave, you can see actually people really didn't call about that. The area that's in the grey under the third wave here is actually vaccines. So I guess the question is, what if we weren't talking about COVID, what were we talking about? So this is actually the hierarchical map for the topics of conversation if we take COVID out of the equation. And you can see here, probably unsurprisingly, what we talked about was drugs, bloods, relapses, mobility, sensory symptoms, everything that we would have been talking about anyway. And then once I broke it down to look at the proportions pre-COVID, what we found is actually the top 5 didn't change. So disease-modifying treatments, bloods, relapses, mobility, and pain were the top 5, both pre-COVID and during COVID. So thing to be aware of here is this represents frequency of topic rather than individual patient calls. What I couldn't do in retrospect was separate one person who may be phoned multiple times. So obviously that may skew how the data is interpreted. So what caused this pattern of calls? Well, that got me thinking, was it COVID-19, even if we weren't specifically talking about it? Was it that patients were reaching out more to us for reassurance about underlying symptoms? Or was it that anxiety and stress and infection was causing people to have flares in their MS? Was it something to do with the wider service factors in that patients couldn't get hold of GPs, they couldn't get hold of opticians, so they phoned us? I think there's probably a little bit of that in there. Or was it that the fact that we had shifted towards telehealth kind of blurred these boundaries between scheduled care and unscheduled care? Certainly, if we look at the number of calls that I made during that period, there's some suggestion that that's what happened to me. Or is it that there has actually been a genuine change in the way that our patients are using the MS service, either caused by the pandemic or maybe facilitated by the pandemic? And is this going to persist after COVID-19 has kind of become less of an issue? And if so, what does that mean for our service? Well, in 2019, the Scottish Government created this neurological framework for action to move towards better standards of care for all adults with neurological conditions in Scotland. The framework makes specific commitments towards co-production services, supported self-management, use of digital health, and then improving visibility of information across all the sectors. So COVID's created many challenges, but also, there is a little bit of an opportunity here to look at our service and try and take forward some of these commitments. So, immediate actions, we've looked at ways to deal with the visibility of data at a local level. If this audit has highlighted anything, it's that it's very difficult to find this information. So, by August of 2020, what we've done is created Track Care Clinics, which is our booking service, so that we can document calls as they come into the advice line, so that we can then facilitate workforce planning. I also created an advice line form, which is a bit like a triage sheet, which can be completed at the time of a call and then can be scanned in separately, so that we can then separate scheduled and unscheduled care in the notes. And this might allow us to maybe identify those patients who are needing a little bit more support. Both of these at present are still prohibitively time consuming to do, and we need to find better ways of managing it. Next steps really would be to speak to our patient group and find out if what we've seen from this audit is actually indicative of a desire and a need to change how they're accessing care. We also need to look at the role of the MS nurses here in enabling self-management. I think one thing that's very evident is that we are spending a lot of the time on the phone with patients outside of scheduled clinics. And is this the best way of helping them to manage their condition? And then really to look at how digital health solutions could be used to achieve these goals. So digital health adoption obviously is a huge target for all the health services at the moment. Within Scotland, we have something called SERPA, which is the renal patient portal, where patients can access their own blood results. That helps them to change their diet or their medications accordingly. Something like that is very simple, that's well established, and it would be easy to do with our patient population as well. We could take that further. We could look at accessing what we have as an AIMS clinic. So patients come in once a year and have a timed 25-foot walk, a PEG test, a MOCA done, and that data could be made available to them. Health-related quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, they could all be done as well. This would allow patients to maybe get a longitudinal kind of view of their condition and access it separately. So really, what I think this order has shown more than anything is that telehealth is necessary. It's used regularly by our patient group, regardless of COVID. And this has service implications that at the moment are not being identified. In a condition like MS, which is fluctuating and unpredictable, it's going to be likely that unscheduled care needs will remain high. Our service really has to be able to adapt to meet this need. And then whilst the telehealth will remain integral to our service, I think digital health probably offers richer solutions for our patient group. And MS patients in general tend to be early adopters for this kind of thing. So the first thing we need to do is probably start by putting choice into the hands of our patient population, and then looking at how we can work with all sectors to take through these ideas and co-produce a post-COVID service. Thank you very much.